I'm Karen, 34, and until yesterday, I was the dedicated daughter who gave up everything to care for my sick father. That changed during our family dinner when my sister Nancy smirked across the table and announced, "You have 3 days to leave the house." The worst part, Mom and Dad just sat there in silence, avoiding my eyes. The betrayal cut deep, but they had no idea what I was about to discover in our family's history. Before I tell you how I turned the tables on my family's betrayal, drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from, and subscribe if you've ever had to stand up to toxic family members. Our family home in Millfield isn't just any house. The 3-story Victorian with its wraparound porch, ornate gingerbread trim, and stained glass windows has been in our family for 4 generations. Every creaking floorboard and stubborn window tells a story of our history. My father, Gerald, a history professor at Millfield College, used to say, "The house itself was his greatest classroom, filled with artifacts and antiques he'd collected over decades of passionate scholarship." My mother, Beverly, worked as the head librarian at the town library before I was born, but gave up her career to become a full-time homemaker when Nancy arrived 5 years after me. From that moment, the family dynamic shifted in ways I wouldn't fully understand until adulthood. Growing up, I was the responsible one, the achiever, the self-sufficient daughter. Nancy was treated like fine china, delicate, precious, and requiring special care. I remember my 10th birthday when I received a practical bookshelf for my growing collection of novels, while Nancy, who hadn't even expressed interest, received an expensive porcelain doll collection to display. When I questioned the disparity, Mom gently explained, "Your sister needs more encouragement to develop her interests. You're already so motivated on your own." This pattern repeated throughout our childhood. My straight A's were expected and received minimal acknowledgement, while Nancy's occasional B was celebrated with dinner at the fancy restaurant in the next town over. When I won the state debate championship in high school, Dad patted my shoulder with a distracted, "That's my girl." When Nancy landed a minor role in the school play, they attended every performance with bouquets and took the entire cast out for ice cream afterward. I accepted this dynamic because I loved my family. I threw myself into academics, graduated as valedictorian, and earned a full scholarship to Boston University. I double majored in marketing and business administration, working part-time throughout college to cover expenses beyond tuition. Meanwhile, Nancy bounced between 3 different colleges, changing majors 5 times, with our parents covering all costs, including apartments and car payments, without question. After graduation, I built a successful marketing career in Boston, eventually becoming VP of Client Strategy at a respected firm. I found a beautiful apartment in Back Bay, developed close friendships, and fell in love with Paul, a kind-hearted software engineer, who proposed after 3 years together. Life was good, balanced, and finally on my terms. Then came the call that changed everything. 2 years ago, Dad suffered a massive heart attack. Mom was hysterical on the phone, saying she couldn't handle everything alone. Without hesitation, I requested a leave of absence, packed essential belongings, and drove straight to Millfield, leaving Paul with promises to make long-distance work. What was supposed to be a temporary arrangement stretched indefinitely. Dad's recovery was complicated by subsequent minor strokes and periods of confusion. I coordinated his medical care, managed his medications, drove him to countless appointments, and helped with physical therapy exercises daily. I converted the sunroom into a bedroom for him when stairs became too difficult. At night, I worked remotely to maintain some connection to my career, though my advancement naturally stalled. Throughout this time, Nancy remained largely absent despite living just 30 minutes away in Lakeside. She visited monthly at best, usually for brief Sunday lunches, where she'd entertain Mom with stories about her latest endeavor. First interior design classes, then a short-lived candle-making business, followed by attempting to become a social media influencer. Each venture required startup capital, which our parents provided without question. My own sacrifices mounted. The leave of absence became a resignation when my company needed to fill my position permanently. Paul and I tried making long-distance work, but after 6 months of canceled visits and video calls, interrupted by Dad's needs, He gently suggested we take a break. That break became permanent when he accepted a position in Seattle. My savings dwindled as I contributed to household expenses and medical bills not covered by insurance. Throughout it all, I told myself it was temporary. Dad would improve, and I'd rebuild my life. In recent months, his health had indeed stabilized. He was walking with a cane, engaging in conversations again, even talking about possibly returning to teach a light schedule of seminars. I began researching marketing positions in Boston and nearby cities, wondering if I could finally restart my life while remaining close enough to help if needed. That's when I noticed subtle shifts in the family dynamic. Mom began having hushed phone conversations that abruptly ended when I entered the room. Dad seemed uncomfortable during our evening chess games, a ritual we'd established during his recovery. Nancy started visiting more frequently, but spent most time in closed-door conversations with our parents, rather than helping with Dad's care. I chalked it up to everyone adjusting to the idea of me potentially moving on. I never imagined they were plotting to force me out of the home I'd helped preserve through the darkest times. The morning of the day that would change everything dawned bright and clear. I woke early as usual to prepare Dad's morning medications and help him through his exercise routine. He seemed distracted, fumbling with simple movements we'd practiced for months. "Everything okay, Dad?" I asked, steadying his arm as he practiced his balance exercises. "Just tired today," he mumbled, avoiding my eyes. With Dad settled in his favorite armchair with the newspaper, I decided to prepare a special dinner to celebrate his improved health. The latest tests had shown his heart function had improved significantly, and his doctor had reduced 2 medications the previous week. It felt like a milestone worth marking. I spent the morning planning the menu: Dad's favorite pot roast with root vegetables, Mom's special dinner rolls, and blackberry cobbler for dessert. I drove to Wilson's Farm Market for fresh ingredients, splurging on locally grown produce and a bottle of sparkling cider since Dad still couldn't have alcohol. As I was loading groceries into my car, my phone buzzed with a text from Mom. "Nancy's coming for dinner tonight. She has news." I was surprised but pleased. Family dinner with everyone present had become rare. Perhaps Nancy had finally found stable employment or was in a serious relationship. Either would explain the increased family conversations lately. When I arrived home, I was startled to see an unfamiliar luxury SUV in the driveway with a temporary license tag. Inside, I found Nancy in the kitchen with Mom both falling silent as I entered. "Nice car outside," I commented, setting down the grocery bags. Nancy tossed her expertly highlighted hair over her shoulder. "Just got it yesterday. Do you like it?" "It looks expensive," I replied, carefully noting her designer outfit and the large diamond tennis bracelet that definitely hadn't been on her wrist during her last visit. "I'm finally getting the success I deserve," she said with a smug smile. Throughout the afternoon, I noticed Nancy and Mom having whispered conversations that stopped whenever I approached. More concerning was when Nancy spent over an hour with Dad in his study door firmly closed. When they emerged, Dad looked troubled while Nancy appeared triumphant. "Everything okay?" I asked, chopping vegetables for the roast. "Just catching up with Daddy," Nancy replied with artificial sweetness. "He's so proud of my new business venture." By 6 o'clock, dinner was ready. I'd set the dining table with the good china and crystal water glasses, adding fresh flowers from the garden as a centerpiece. Dad made his way to the table without his cane, another small victory I'd hoped we'd celebrate together. As we began eating, the conversation felt strained. Mom kept rearranging her napkin, Dad focused intently on cutting his meat into perfectly uniform pieces, and Nancy kept checking her watch as if waiting for a specific moment. "The roast is delicious, Karen," Dad said, his voice slightly hoarse. "Thanks, Dad. I used Grandma's recipe with a few adjustments," I replied, trying to maintain normalcy despite the tension I couldn't quite identify. "Speaking of recipes," Nancy interjected, "I've been consulting with a renowned interior designer about recipes for modernizing old houses like this one. The potential is amazing." I blinked in confusion. Modernizing? I thought Dad loved the historical integrity of the house. Things change, Mom said softly, not meeting my eyes. We ate in uncomfortable silence for several minutes before Nancy set down her fork with deliberate precision. She dabbed her lips with her napkin, then looked directly at me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "So, Karen," she said, her voice dripping with false pleasantness, "you have 3 days to leave the house." I froze fork midway to my mouth, certain I'd misheard. "Excuse me. 3 days," Nancy repeated now, openly smirking across the dinner table. "Mom and Dad have decided to make some changes. I'll need your keys by Friday." I looked to my parents, expecting confusion protest something, but they just watched in silence, Dad studying his plate, while Mom twisted her wedding ring, her nervous tell since childhood. "What are you talking about?" I finally managed, setting down my fork. "It's time for you to move on with your life," Nancy continued smoothly. "Mom and Dad are selling the house and moving to Lakeside Meadows Retirement Community. I've already put down their deposit." "The house is being sold," I echoed in disbelief. "Dad, is this true?" He cleared his throat but wouldn't meet my eyes. "Lakeside Meadows has excellent medical facilities. It makes sense at our age. But this house has been in the family for generations. You always said you wanted to preserve it." Nancy answered before our parents could. "The market's hot right now. The property alone is worth a fortune to developers. The house itself is outdated and would cost a fortune to properly maintain going forward. So you're just going to sell it to developers to be torn down." I could barely comprehend what I was hearing. "Progress is inevitable, Karen," Nancy said with exaggerated patience. "Not everyone clings to the past like you and Dad used to." The "used to" struck me hard. Dad had dedicated his life to preserving history both professionally and personally. Now he sat silently as Nancy dismissed his life's passion. "And where am I supposed to go in 3 days?" I asked, feeling a wave of panic. "I gave up my apartment in Boston, my job, everything." "You're resourceful," Nancy said dismissively. "You've had 2 years to make arrangements. We assumed you'd go back to Boston eventually." "I stayed to take care of Dad to help the family." My voice cracked with emotion. "And we appreciate that," Mom interjected softly. "But you need to get back to your own life. This arrangement was never meant to be permanent." "Arrangement?" I repeated in disbelief. "I gave up everything to come here, of my career, my fiancé, my savings." "Don't be so dramatic," Nancy sighed. "This is a family decision that benefits everyone. The retirement community is paid for, Mom and Dad will be well cared for, and you're free to restart your life. Everyone wins." "Everyone except me," I said quietly. "When was this decided? How long have you all been planning this behind my back?" "The details were finalized last week," Nancy replied. "I've already engaged contractors to assess the property before listing. They start Monday, so you really do need to be out by then." I stared at my family, these people I thought I knew completely. Dad still wouldn't meet my gaze. Mom looked uncomfortable but resolute. And Nancy looked triumphant. Without another word, I pushed back from the table and walked upstairs to what had been my childhood bedroom and was now my only home. Behind me, I heard the murmur of conversation resume as if my departure was merely a minor interruption to their dinner plans. Sitting on my bed, surrounded by the mix of childhood mementos and adult necessities that represented my interrupted life, I felt like the ground had disappeared beneath me. After everything I'd sacrificed, I was being discarded with less consideration than an unwanted piece of furniture. And I didn't even understand why. As tears streamed down my face, I tried to make sense of what had just happened. The betrayal cut deep. Not just Nancy's smug announcement, but my parents' silent complicity. How could they sit there and say nothing after all I'd done? I thought about the career I'd put on hold that had likely moved beyond my reach now. The broken engagement with Paul, who had recently announced his engagement to someone else on social media. the savings account that had dwindled to almost nothing as I contributed to household expenses and medical bills. All sacrificed without hesitation because family came first. Or so I'd believed. As my initial shock subsided, a memory surfaced. About 6 months ago, during one of our evening chess games, Dad had mentioned something odd about the house. We'd been discussing repairs needed for the leaking conservatory roof, and I'd suggested hiring a specific contractor. "We should consult your grandfather's papers before making any structural changes," Dad had said cryptically. "The house has special provisions." At the time, I'd assumed he was referring to historical preservation guidelines. But now his words took on new significance. With growing unease, I wiped my eyes and walked to Dad's study. The organized filing system I'd implemented during his recovery made it easy to locate the family documents. But strangely, several folders were missing, including the one labeled property that I distinctly remembered creating. That's when I decided to check the attic. Dad had always been somewhat sentimental, keeping old papers and family records in his grandfather's steamer trunk stored there. Grabbing my phone for light, I quietly made my way up the narrow stairs, careful to avoid the third step that always creaked loudly. The attic was dusty and cramped, illuminated only by moonlight filtering through the small round window and my phone's flashlight. I moved carefully between stacked boxes and forgotten furniture, toward the far corner where Dad kept his most precious items. Behind an old dress form Mom had used for sewing years ago, I found what I was looking for. Great-grandfather's steamer trunk with brass fittings. The key was still hidden in the small carved wooden box on top, just as it had been during the treasure hunt games Dad created for me as a child. Inside the trunk, beneath layers of old photographs and school reports, I found a leather portfolio labeled Hawthorne House, Legal. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside was my great-grandmother Martha's will, the pages yellowed with age, but the text still clear. The property at 815 Orchard Street, Millfield, including the Victorian house known as Hawthorne House and all lands thereto, I leave in perpetual trust for the benefit of my descendants. The property shall not be sold, transferred, or substantially altered without the unanimous written consent of all living direct descendants of my bloodline. I read further, my heart racing. The will established that the house wasn't owned outright by my parents as I'd always believed. It was held in a family trust with strict conditions. More importantly, as a direct descendant of Martha Hawthorne, I had legal rights to the property that couldn't be dismissed by anyone, not even my parents. Beneath the will were more recent documents that made my blood run cold. Power of attorney papers dated just 3 months ago, giving Nancy full authority to make financial and property decisions on behalf of our father. Dad's signature looked shaky, nothing like his usual precise penmanship. I checked the date again. 3 months ago, Dad had been on heavy medication following a minor stroke. His cognitive abilities had been significantly impaired. He couldn't even remember how to operate the television remote, let alone comprehend complex legal documents. Digging deeper, I found bank statements showing large withdrawals from my parents' accounts, all after the power of attorney was established. The most recent statement showed a withdrawal of $50,000 just last week, roughly matching the down payment for the luxury SUV in our driveway. At the very bottom of the trunk was a folder containing emails printed out, correspondence between Nancy and someone named Marcus Reynolds at Reynolds Development Group. The emails detailed plans to purchase Hawthorne House, demolish it, and build luxury condominiums on the property. The most recent email included the line, "Once the current occupant's sister is removed, we can proceed with the purchase agreement as discussed." Another email from Nancy to this developer stated, "My parents will sign whatever I put in front of them. They'll be comfortable in the retirement community, and what happens to the house afterward won't concern them." The final document made everything clear. A preliminary sales agreement for $1.2 million with a special addendum stating that 20% would be paid directly to Nancy as a finder's fee, separate from the main transaction. The retirement community deposit mentioned at dinner was just $20,000, a fraction of what Nancy would personally receive. As I carefully photographed each document with my phone, a transformation happened inside me. The hurt and betrayal were still there, but now they crystallized into something else: determination. For the first time in my adult life, I was seeing my family situation with complete clarity without the filter of obligation and self-sacrifice I'd always looked through. Descending from the attic documents safely stored both physically and digitally, I was no longer just the dutiful daughter who had given up everything for family. I was a woman who had been wronged and who had discovered the means to fight back. I barely slept that night, my mind racing with everything I'd discovered. By dawn, I had a plan forming, but knew I needed professional help to execute it properly. At 7:30 a.m., I called Thomas Bradley, a family attorney who had handled various matters for my grandfather and whom I remembered meeting at his funeral. "Karen Hawthorne, it's been years. How are your parents doing?" he asked when his secretary connected us. "That's actually related to why I'm calling," I said carefully. "I've discovered some concerning documents about our family home. Could I see you today? It's urgent." 2 hours later, I sat in Thomas's wood-paneled office in downtown Millfield, having slipped out while Mom was at her garden club meeting and Nancy was still asleep. The elderly attorney listened intently as I explained the situation, his expression growing increasingly grave. "May I see what you found?" he asked when I finished. I handed over the copies I'd made of the willpower of attorney bank statements and emails. Thomas reviewed everything methodically, occasionally making notes. Finally, he removed his reading glasses and sighed deeply. "Karen, what they're attempting is problematic on multiple levels. First, your great-grandmother's trust creates what we call a bloodline covenant, requiring unanimous family consent for any sale. That's still legally binding." "So they can't sell without my agreement?" I asked. "Correct. Furthermore, this power of attorney is highly suspicious. You said your father was heavily medicated at the time." I nodded. He had suffered a minor stroke. He was on several medications that affected his cognitive function. He couldn't even remember his doctor's names at that point. Thomas's expression darkened. "That could constitute exploitation of an incapacitated person. We should get his medical records from that period." I pulled out my phone. "I can call Dr. Lloyd now. I took Dad to all his appointments, so he knows me well." Dr. Lloyd was professionally concerned when I explained the situation. "I can confirm that on the date this document was signed, Gerald was not medically competent to understand complex legal matters. His cognitive assessment that week showed significant impairment in judgment and reasoning. I would be willing to provide an official statement to that effect." After ending the call, Thomas continued reviewing the documents. "There's another issue here. These bank statements show you've been making substantial contributions to the household and medical expenses." "Yes," I confirmed. "I've been using most of my savings to help with Dad's care. I even helped with the property taxes when they couldn't manage them last year." "That potentially gives you an equitable interest in the property," Thomas said, making more notes. "And these emails demonstrate clear intent to defraud you of your rightful share and to take advantage of your parents." By noon, Thomas had outlined a preliminary legal strategy. The evidence clearly showed that 1. The property transfer to Nancy via power of attorney was potentially fraudulent due to Dad's cognitive impairment. 2. The planned sale violated my great-grandmother's trust requirements. 3. My financial contributions gave me an additional claim to the property. 4. The emails demonstrated a deliberate scheme to enrich Nancy at everyone else's expense. "What's my next step?" I asked, feeling a mix of vindication and sadness that it had come to this. "Gather more evidence of your financial contributions," Thomas advised. "Bank statements, canceled checks, receipts. Also, we should look into whether Hawthorne House qualifies for historical designation, which would create additional barriers to demolition." The Historical Society has approached Dad about this before, I recalled. He always put it off, wanting to maintain control over any renovations. Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "Contact them immediately. Even a pending application could delay any development plans. Also speak with the county records office about the trust documentation." and we should determine if your father's medical condition has improved enough for him to truly understand what Nancy is proposing. After leaving Thomas's office, I drove to my bank and requested complete records of all transactions between my account and household expenses for the past 2 years. The stack of statements clearly showed regular substantial transfers, far more than what might be considered normal contribution to household expenses. Next, I visited the county records office and requested copies of the property tax payments and utility bills. Just as I suspected, the receipts showed many payments had come from my personal account during Dad's illness. As I sat in my car reviewing everything I'd gathered, my phone rang. It was Martin Edwards, a retired judge and longtime family friend who had been my father's colleague at the college. "Karen, I was just thinking about you. How's your father doing these days?" The genuine warmth in his voice brought tears to my eyes. After a moment's hesitation, I decided to trust him with the truth. "Actually, Judge Edwards, I could really use your advice on a legal matter involving Dad." With documents safely stored in my car, I spent the afternoon building my support network. Judge Edwards had been appalled by Nancy's actions and offered both legal insights and moral support. "Your great-grandmother Martha was a remarkable woman," he told me. "I remember your grandfather telling stories about how she insisted on that trust to protect the house from being sold off during the Depression. She'd be proud of you for standing up for her legacy." My next call was to Paul, my former fiancé. Despite our breakup, we'd maintained amicable if distant communication. As a corporate attorney, his perspective would be valuable. "Karen, this is clearly fraudulent," he said after I explained the situation. "The power of attorney alone would likely be invalidated given your father's condition, but combined with the trust violations and evidence of self-dealing, your sister has created a legal nightmare for herself." His professional assessment was reassuring, but it was his personal support that meant more. "For what it's worth, I always thought your family took advantage of your generosity. I'm glad you're finally standing up for yourself." My best friend Donna had experienced similar family dynamics with her own brother and offered emotional support from her perspective 5 years after her own family confrontation. "It gets better," she promised. "Setting boundaries with family feels impossible at first, but once you do it, you'll wonder why you waited so long. The guilt fades, I promise." By late afternoon, I decided to visit Agnes Whitmore, our elderly neighbor, who had lived next door to Hawthorne House for over 50 years. Agnes had been a history teacher at the local high school and had always taken special interest in local architectural preservation. "Your great-grandmother Martha and I were friends in my younger days," Agnes revealed as she served tea in delicate cups. "She was determined that house would remain in the family. Did you know she stood up to developers even back in the 1940s when they wanted to build a shopping center there?" "I had no idea," I admitted. Agnes disappeared into her study and returned with a yellowed newspaper clipping. "Martha Hawthorne Fights for Family Legacy," read the headline, with a photograph of my great-grandmother standing defiantly on the porch of our house. She created that trust after her husband died, leaving her with 4 children and numerous relatives suggesting she sell the property. "Some things are worth more than money," she used to say. "A family needs roots to grow strong." Agnes also shared that the house had significant historical value beyond our family connection. It's one of the few remaining examples of Second Empire Victorian architecture in the county. The Historical Society has been hoping to add it to the registry for years. This information gave me another avenue to pursue. Before leaving Agnes's house, I called Ronald Patterson at the Millfield Historical Society, who was thrilled to hear from a Hawthorne descendant interested in preservation. "We can file an emergency application for historical designation," he explained excitedly. "With your support as a family member, the process could be expedited. Once designated, any significant alterations or demolition would require extensive review and approval." My cousin Sharon, whom I hadn't spoken with in years, provided another piece of the puzzle when I called her that evening. "I'm not surprised Nancy is pulling something like this," she said. "Did you know she approached my dad last year asking for a loan to start a business? When he refused, she stopped speaking to him entirely." Sharon also had copies of family documents from my grandfather's estate planning that further confirmed the bloodline covenant on the house. Grandpa was very clear about it when he explained the family trust to my dad. No one person can decide to sell Hawthorne House. Every direct descendant has to agree. By evening, I had built a network of support and gathered substantial evidence. I also had contacted Roy Henderson, a former colleague who now worked for a real estate news publication. His research on Reynolds Development Group revealed a troubling pattern. They specialize in acquiring historic properties through questionable means, Roy explained. They've been sued 3 times in the last 5 years for predatory practices, particularly targeting elderly homeowners. They typically use a local connection to facilitate the deal. Sounds like your sister filled that role. With each conversation, each piece of evidence, my confidence grew. The hurt of betrayal remained, but it was overshadowed by a newfound determination. For the first time, I wasn't just reacting to my family's dynamics. I was taking control of my own place within it. I returned home just before dinner, carefully composed and ready for what would come next. Nancy's car was still in the driveway, and through the dining room window, I could see her gesturing animatedly while talking to our parents. This was no longer just about a house or an inheritance. It was about standing up to years of manipulation and taking my rightful place at the family table. The next morning, I woke early and organized all my evidence on the dining room table, the same table where Nancy had delivered her ultimatum just 36 hours earlier. I arranged everything methodically. Trust documents on one side, financial records in the middle, and the emails exposing Nancy's scheme on the right. Thomas had also emailed me a preliminary legal assessment, which I printed and added to the pile. I heard movement upstairs as the rest of the family began stirring. Mom was always first down for coffee, followed by Dad, who still maintained his professor's habit of early rising despite retirement. Nancy typically slept late, a luxury she'd always been afforded while I was expected to be productive from dawn. "Good morning, Karen," Mom said as she entered the kitchen, startling slightly when she saw me sitting at the fully set dining table rather than preparing breakfast as usual. "Is everything okay?" "We need to have a family meeting," I replied calmly. "Could you please ask Dad and Nancy to join us? It's important." She hesitated, noting the documents spread across the table, then nodded and went upstairs. I could hear muffled voices, then the sound of multiple footsteps. Dad appeared first, still in his robe and looking concerned. "Karen, what's all this about?" "Please sit down, Dad. This concerns all of us." My voice remained steady, though my heart was racing. Nancy appeared last dressed in designer loungewear, her expression shifting from annoyed to wary when she saw the papers on the table. "What's going on?" she demanded, making no move to sit. "I think you know," I replied evenly. "Please, everyone, take a seat. What I have to say won't take long, but you all need to hear it." Something in my tone must have registered because they all complied, Mom and Dad exchanging nervous glances while Nancy crossed her arms defensively. "Yesterday at dinner," I began, "Nancy informed me that I have 3 days to leave my home. Today I'm informing all of you that your plans to sell Hawthorne House are not just morally wrong, but legally impossible." I slid the trust documents toward them. "Great-grandmother Martha placed this house in a bloodline trust. It cannot be sold without unanimous consent from all direct descendants, which includes me." Mom's hand flew to her throat. "I don't understand. Howard always handled the property matters." "Howard is my grandfather. Mom," I corrected gently. "Dad's father. The house came through your side of the family through your grandmother Martha." Dad looked genuinely confused. "I knew there were restrictions, but I thought they expired when your mother inherited." "They didn't," I said firmly. "The trust is perpetual. And speaking of legal matters, let's discuss this." I placed the power of attorney documents in front of them. Nancy obtained power of attorney over Dad 3 months ago when he was heavily medicated and cognitively impaired following his stroke. Nancy's face flushed. "That's ridiculous. Dad knew exactly what he was signing." "Dr. Lloyd disagrees," I countered, sliding over the doctor's statement. He's prepared to testify that Dad was not competent to understand complex legal documents at that time. Dad picked up the medical assessment, reading it with growing distress. I don't even remember signing this, he admitted quietly. There were so many papers during that period. Which makes the power of attorney invalid, I continued, as do the subsequent financial transactions. I spread out the bank statements showing large withdrawals. $50,000 last week alone, coinciding with Nancy's new SUV purchase. Mom gasped, turning to Nancy. You said that money was for our retirement community deposit. Nancy's composure began to crack. It was an advance for my portion of the house sale. I deserved something for all the work I've been doing to secure your future. Your future, you mean? I corrected, revealing the emails between Nancy and Reynolds Development. 20% finder's fee on a $1.2 million sale. That's $240,000 directly to you, while Mom and Dad get a tiny retirement apartment worth a fraction of the house's value. Dad's face had grown increasingly pale as he read through the development plans. They want to demolish the house, build condominiums. That was always the plan, I confirmed, though it would have faced another obstacle. I filed an emergency application with the Historical Society to have Hawthorne House designated a protected historical property. Nancy stood abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. This is ridiculous. You can't just swoop in after I've spent months planning everything and ruin it all. Planning to defraud our parents and disinherit me, you mean? I remained seated, maintaining my composure. The emails make your intentions quite clear. You went through my personal emails, she sputtered. They were printed out in Dad's trunk, along with the sales agreement showing how you plan to profit personally while giving our parents a fraction of the property's value. Mom was now openly crying. Nancy, how could you? We trusted you. Nancy's strategy shifted instantly, her eyes filling with calculated tears. I was just trying to secure all our futures. Karen abandoned her responsibilities and someone had to step up. The retirement community would have taken care of all your needs, while you walked away with nearly $250,000, I finished for her. That doesn't sound like putting our parents first. Dad, who had been silently reading through the documents, finally looked up. His expression had transformed from confusion to clarity. The power of attorney is revoked, he said firmly. As of this moment. You can't just revoke it, Nancy protested. Actually, he can, I explained, especially given the evidence of self-dealing and the medical testimony regarding his capacity when it was signed. I turned to face my family directly. Here's what's going to happen. You all have 24 hours to acknowledge my legal right to remain in this house as a beneficiary of the family trust. The fraudulent power of attorney will be formally revoked with proper documentation. Any plans to sell or develop the property are immediately terminated. Or what? Nancy challenged, though her voice lacked conviction. Or I file these documents with the court tomorrow morning, I replied calmly. Thomas Bradley is prepared to request an emergency injunction against any property transfer, along with a full investigation into financial exploitation of vulnerable adults. Judge Edwards has already reviewed the preliminary evidence and believes we have a strong case. The mention of the respected retired judge seemed to finally penetrate Nancy's defiance. Her shoulders slumped slightly. You're bluffing, she tried weakly. You wouldn't drag the family through a public court case. I wouldn't have thought my family would try to make me homeless after I gave up everything to care for them, I countered evenly. Yet here we are. Dad cleared his throat. There will be no court case because Karen is right. The house belongs to the family trust. I'm ashamed I didn't protect it better. He turned to me with tears in his eyes. And I'm ashamed I didn't protect you better. Mom reached across the table to grasp my hand. I had no idea about the finder's fee or the development plans. We thought the sale would benefit everyone, including you eventually. Nancy told us you'd be fine, Dad admitted, that you had your education and career prospects to fall back on while she was still struggling to find stability. the irony was painful. The same narrative of me being the capable one who needed less support had once again been used against me. I gave up my career to come home, I reminded them quietly. I spent my savings helping with household expenses and medical bills. I broke off my engagement because I put family first. And in return, I was going to be left with nothing. For the first time, I saw genuine remorse in my parents' eyes. Not just for the recent betrayal, but perhaps for the lifetime pattern it represented. Nancy, seeing the tide turning decisively against her, made one last attempt. "This is emotional manipulation. You're turning them against me with selective evidence. The evidence speaks for itself," I replied, still maintaining my composure. "Every email, every bank statement, every legal document tells the same story." I stood gathering my personal copies of all the evidence. "You have 24 hours to decide, acknowledge my rights, and work toward a fair resolution for everyone, or face the legal consequences of what's been done. I'll be staying with Agnes tonight to give you time to discuss privately." As I walked toward the door, Dad called after me, his voice breaking. "Karen, wait. There's no need to leave. This is your home. It always has been." I turned back, seeing my father clearly for perhaps the first time, not the intimidating professor or the helpless patient, but simply a man who had made mistakes and was finally acknowledging them. "I'll be back tomorrow morning," I said gently. "We all need time to think about what happens next." With that, I walked out, carrying with me not just the evidence of betrayal, but the newfound strength to demand the respect I'd earned. The following day dawned clear and bright, a stark contrast to the turbulent emotions of the previous days. I'd spent a restful night at Agnes's house, her wisdom and stories about my great-grandmother providing unexpected comfort. By morning, I felt centered and clear about the path forward. Thomas Bradley had arranged for us to meet at his office at 10 Husro a.m., neutral territory for what would hopefully be a resolution rather than the escalation of a legal battle. I dressed in a simple but professional navy dress that I'd worn to marketing presentations in my former life, armor of a sort for the confrontation ahead. When I arrived at the brick colonial building that housed Thomas's law practice, I was surprised to see all 3 family members already waiting in the reception area. Dad looked tired, but determined. Mom appeared anxious, and Nancy sat rigidly in a corner chair staring at her phone. Thomas greeted us warmly, showing everyone into his wood-paneled conference room where documents were already arranged at each place setting. Once seated, he began with professional courtesy. "I understand we're here to resolve a family property dispute without court intervention. Karen has shared her concerns and evidence with me, and I've prepared several options for resolution." Dad cleared his throat. "Before we get to those options, I have something to say." He turned to face me directly. "Karen, your mother and I spent most of the night reviewing everything: the trust documents, the financial records, and most painfully, our own behavior over many years." Mom nodded, tears in her eyes. "We failed you repeatedly, not just with this house situation, but throughout your life. We took your strength and independence for granted while catering to Nancy's demands. It wasn't fair, and we're deeply sorry." This frank acknowledgement after decades of imbalance was almost overwhelming. I managed a nod, not trusting my voice quite yet. Dad continued, "I've formally revoked the power of attorney. I've also contacted Reynolds Development to cancel any preliminary agreements Nancy may have initiated." Nancy made a small sound of protest, but fell silent when Dad looked her way. "As for the house," Dad went on, "you're absolutely right about the trust. I should have remembered and honored its terms. The house belongs to all of us as a family, with each descendant having an equal say in its future." Thomas nodded approvingly and slid forward the first document. "I've prepared an acknowledgement of the trust terms for everyone to sign, confirming Karen's equal standing as a beneficiary and her right to remain in the property." One by one, my parents signed. Nancy hesitated, then grudgingly added her signature when Dad gave her a firm look. "Next," Thomas continued, We have the matter of Karen's substantial financial contributions to the household and medical expenses during Gerald's illness. He presented a second document. This acknowledges that Karen has contributed approximately $78,000 toward household expenses, property taxes, and medical care over the past 2 years. These contributions will be recognized as an equitable interest in the property. Again, my parents readily signed. Nancy's pen moved more slowly, but she eventually complied. Finally, Thomas said, "We have the matter of future arrangements." This was the document I'd been most involved in drafting. A fair resolution that acknowledged everyone's needs while protecting the house itself. The agreement proposes that Hawthorne House remain in the family trust, as great-grandmother Martha intended, Thomas explained. Karen will have the right to reside in the East Wing, which will be renovated into a separate apartment with its own entrance. Gerald and Beverly will maintain the main portion of the house for as long as they wish, with provisions for live-in care if needed in the future. Dad nodded. This is what we want. The retirement community was never our idea. We were told it was the only reasonable option given maintenance costs and my health concerns. And what about me? Nancy asked, speaking for the first time. Where do I fit in this perfect arrangement? I'd anticipated this question. The agreement includes renovation of the carriage house into a guest apartment that you can use when visiting. And should the family ever unanimously decide to sell the property in the future, the proceeds would be divided equally among all beneficiaries. It was far more than Nancy deserved given her attempted manipulation, but I'd decided that breaking the cycle of inequity meant not perpetuating it myself, even when justified. Nancy seemed surprised by this inclusion. That's fair, she admitted reluctantly. Additionally, Thomas added, the historical designation application will proceed, which provides tax benefits that can help offset maintenance costs. As the final signatures were added to the documents, I felt a weight lifting that I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying, not just from the recent betrayal, but from decades of accepting less than I deserved from my family. Outside Thomas's office, Nancy immediately headed for her car without a word. Mom called after her, but Dad gently held her back. Give her time, he said quietly. This is a significant adjustment to her expectations. I'm not holding my breath for an apology, I replied honestly. Neither am I, Dad surprised me by saying. But this isn't about Nancy anymore. It's about making things right with you. The following months brought remarkable changes to both Hawthorne House and our family dynamics. The historical designation was approved, bringing both protection for the property and tax advantages that eased the financial burden of maintenance. With my background in marketing, I created a small business giving tours of the historic property on weekends, generating income while sharing the house's rich history with the community. Dad's health continued to improve as he threw himself into documenting the house's architectural significance and the family's connection to local history. The East Wing renovation became a healing project for Dad and me, him returning to his architectural roots, me learning skills I'd always admired in him. We spent evenings poring over blueprints, finding a new relationship based on mutual respect rather than obligation. Mom struggled more with the changes, decades of enabling behavior harder to break. But she made genuine efforts, asking about my plans, acknowledging my contributions, even joining a support group for parents working to build healthier relationships with adult children. Nancy remained distant occasionally, sending terse text messages to our parents, but maintaining her life in Lakeside. The luxury SUV disappeared after a few months, replaced by a more modest sedan, suggesting her financial situation had adjusted to the loss of her anticipated windfall. 6 months after that fateful dinner, I sat on the newly restored Victorian porch of Hawthorne House enjoying the spring evening. My phone buzzed with a message from Paul, who had remained supportively in touch since our conversation during the crisis. In town next weekend for a conference. Coffee. It wasn't a romantic overture, but it represented something equally valuable, a connection to the life and identity I'd nearly lost in the fog of family obligation. The journey from betrayal to standing my ground had transformed me in ways I never expected. I'd learned that family love shouldn't require self-erasure, that setting boundaries wasn't selfish, but necessary, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do, for yourself and others, is to break destructive patterns that have been normalized through repetition. Most importantly, I discovered that my value wasn't determined by others' recognition of it. It existed independently, requiring neither validation nor comparison to be real and substantial. I'd found my voice, my boundaries, and in doing so had honored great-grandmother Martha's legacy far more truly than any blind sacrifice could have done. Have you ever had to stand up to family members who took your kindness for granted? Do you think I made the right choice in offering Nancy a fair share despite her behavior? If you've experienced similar family dynamics, comment below with how you handled it. Don't forget to like this video. If it resonated with you, subscribe for more real-life stories about finding your strength in difficult situations, and share with someone who might need to hear that setting boundaries with family isn't selfish. It's essential for healing. Thank you for listening to my journey, and remember, standing up for yourself doesn't mean you love your family any less. It means you finally included yourself in that circle of care.